This evening we have an interesting talk, I think it's going to be, about what our speaker calls affective polarization. And as I understand it, this is just sort of an extension of general lack of civility into politics, where people are more interested in destroying their opponents than they are in governing, and more interested in winning than they are in seeing programs that help us lowly citizens. Bill Hurst is author of Our Great Political Divide. I think you may be able to find copies of it for sale in the back there after the program. He is a treasurer of Baroda Township, I should mention.
My supervisor is right there.
And the town supervisor is right here.
Maybe you want to be anonymous.
And has degrees from Williams and Northwest Kellogg School. Before I introduce him, I want to thank you for showing up this evening. And on behalf of the sponsors of this program, the Friends of the New Buffalo Library. So please welcome Bill Hurst.
Well, thank you for coming tonight. We're going to be talking about our dysfunctional democracy. Before I dive into the talk, I want to suggest the following: that you engage with your neighbors to understand their views. And those conversations can get really heated. And when they do, my suggestion is that you walk a mile in their shoes, because that way, when they want to get back at you, you are a mile away, and you've got their shoes. So, anyway, it's a somber topic, so I wanted to start with a little bit of humor. I appreciate being invited here by Friends of the Library, being able to share what I've learned with you. No topic could be more important right now for those of us who are interested in our democracy.
Announcements.
Oh, yeah, some announcements. Of course, silence your phones. We are going to hold questions until the end because there's a lot of material to go through. As you might guess, this is a pretty complex topic. I'll be passing out a reading list at the beginning of the Q&A because I can only cover things at a high level, and so you may want to dig in afterwards. My books are for sale at the back. The book I've written, Our Political Divide. This is being recorded, so just be aware of that. It'll probably be on YouTube, and really thank you for attending. So my goal today is to provide you with a framework. It's just going to be a sketch for understanding democracy's dysfunction. I don't have time to cover all these specific topics in great detail. You can look at the reading list and start digging in on your own. What I want to leave you with are some key threads of a story. So I want to just tell a story today. I'm not going to have a lot of statistics. It's going to be more of what are the problems, root causes, etc., that I believe is the case. There's a lot of different ways of looking at this. I mean, I've done a lot of reading. People have a lot of different ways of talking about it. But I'll talk about it the way I think makes sense. First, I'm going to cover how we got so polarized and explain why polarization has turned into, as Bob said, affective polarization. That is intense dislike for the other party and its members. Next, I define liberal democracy so we know what we're talking about in terms of what's threatened. Then I discuss the threats to liberal democracy. The first two threats, economic shocks and cultural conflict, can be thought of as sources of discontent, reducing support for democracy. The third threat, populist demagogues, are politicians who utilize that discontent, particularly cultural discontent, and even economic discontent translates in the end because people view things through a cultural lens, so they become resentful, and that's how things become cultural. As reducing support for democracy. The third threat, populist demagogues, are politicians who utilize the discontent and they utilize effective polarization, dislike of the other side to gain power. And the fourth threat, disinformation, is a key tool that populist demagogues use to eat away at our democracy from within. And hostile countries also engage in disinformation to erode our democracy. Having outlined the threats, I then turn to the unique vulnerabilities of our democracy to resist these threats. Bottom line, our political institutions exacerbate conflict and increase extremism instead of managing extremism through systematic incentives to negotiate and solve problems for the public good. I'm going to explain why our system decentivizes cooperation and negotiation. For solutions, I offer just a few that I think would be the most potent. So let's start with how we got so divided. We'll start with how the political parties divided, and then how the people, the voters, divided. It's helpful to see what things looked like before they were divided, just after World War II. The two parties, and this is really key, were actually four parties under the hood. The Democrats had Southern whites and the urban working class, and the Republicans had a progressive Northern wing and an anti-government, more libertarian group of Western conservatives. The two parties made up of these four groups overlapped in terms of values and ideology significantly. In fact, the more conservative party was probably the Democratic Party because of its Southern members. Legislation until about 1980 was created bottom-up and bipartisan legislative committees where different factions would come together on particular issues. Each committee had its own hired experts, not lobbyists. The structure encouraged negotiation and compromise, and it worked well except on civil rights, where Southern Democrats kept all such bills, such as anti-lynching bills, off the table. Polarization was at a minimum because of the party overlaps. Each party did not stand for distinct values. With civil rights introduced by Lyndon Johnson, this changed. The Democrats became the party of civil rights. Johnson knew he might be giving up the South, and this came to be the case when Goldwater in 1964 adopted his Southern strategy. And he lost everywhere except in 5 or 6 Southern states. He signaled he was for civil rights but against its enforcement. And that sort of became what the Republicans were able to do after that, as Nixon adopted the same kind of strategy. And through Agnew, he adopted the language of George Wallace. If I had more time, I'd give you some quotes, but some of them are amazing. One thing that Agnew said, I'll just tell you, is he said, "I am just so excited that I've been able to divide the country. That has been my mission. I'm so proud of it." And that's not the exact quote, of course, but it is very much that. With civil rights, the late 60s and 70s were challenging for Democrats. They struggled to respond to that backlash against a more violent civil rights movement, dysfunction that accompanied hardcore poverty in inner cities, affirmative action, forced busing, and the reaction of social conservatives to the permissiveness of the counterculture. They just really didn't have a convincing reaction to bring back the people who were leaving their party because of those things. Ronald Reagan took up the mantle of the modern Republican alliance. What he did was he was able to take the social conservatives and the anti-regulation, anti-government business interests and combine them. He also added Christian evangelicals who turned against what they felt was government overreach when Carter's IRS enforced desegregation. What Carter's IRS did was it withdrew tax-exempt status from Christian private schools, and that turned the Christian evangelicals against the Democratic Party. But they were social conservatives, so there was a natural fit there as well. These changes in party alignments were accompanied by nationalization and professionalization of the parties. Fundraising became nationalized and critical to congressmen as campaigns became more expensive. In the 1980s and 1990s, Democratic and Republican leadership tightened the control of committees and party platforms, and in a 50-50 environment since the 1990s, in both the Senate and the House, winning control has trumped legislative collaboration. messaging bills in a divided Congress became the key vehicles to record and then use symbolic vote to campaign against the other party. The parties also developed differently, with Republicans becoming an anti-government ideological party with more unified messaging, and Democrats became a coalition party pushing for incremental programs to solve specific problems. As Democrats represent specific interests, they are more challenged to come up with messaging. One quote I like that I've read is, "To be a card-carrying Democrat, you have to have a very roomy wallet as you deal with all the special interests. As the two parties are so different, they often talk past each other." Now let's talk about the people dividing. Over decades, American voters also divided, sorting into separate geographies and communities, as their choices were not limited to where they lived, but to a whole collection of characteristics. That became part of what it meant to be a Republican or a Democrat. Republicans, a much larger percentage of whom never moved, are more place-based, living in and near the towns they grew up in, which tend to be rural. They take pride in those towns, belonging to local organizations like the American Legion, or they are volunteer firemen, like in our town. Republicans also tend to be family-oriented, religious, and listen to conservative media. They also tend to be white. Democrats tend to be cosmopolitan, more, or at least they think they are, more likely to travel and move, urban, secular, and they listen to mainstream media. The Democratic Party is more diverse, having a high percentage of non-whites, African Americans, Asians, and Hispanics. So belonging to a political party correlates with a lifestyle, a worldview. Being a Republican or a Democrat even corresponds to a type of morality. Liberals are philosophically rooted in universalist norms, valuing human beings wherever they may live. They are concerned primarily with protecting the vulnerable, who are harmed by unequal power relationships. According to Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a great book that's on the reading list, The Righteous Mind, liberals are missing the values of loyalty, authority, and religious sanctity, as they emphasize individual autonomy is more important than these. Conservatives, on the other hand, have a thicker set of moral beliefs, more like the rest of the non-Western world. Philosophically, they're rooted in intuitionist group norms. Fairness is about the group. Have those rewards that distribution is giving out, have they been earned? Loyalty and hierarchy are prized, as is sanctity derived from religious rituals and rules. Conservative morality has some political advantages, as it can appeal to nationalism and religious concerns and can be used to rally the base. Now, what does this all mean in terms of how we get along? Social scientists and psychologists have done many experiments that show that human beings are groupish. We are hardwired towards in-group favoritism and have a negative bias towards out-groups. It doesn't take much for groups to turn on each other. That is built into our makeup. When groups are as different in their characteristics as Democrats and Republicans, emotional dislike can get even more intense. Liliana Mason in Uncivil Agreement describes why this happens and what this does to our politics. The American electorate has sorted itself into two increasingly homogenous parties with a variety of social, economic, geographic, and ideological cleavages falling in line with a partisan divide. And then she says, when multiple identities are strongly aligned, a threat to one identity affects the status of multiple other identities. The possible damage to a person's self-esteem grows as more identities are partnered. So this is why when we win or lose elections, we become so despondent. And when we win them, we become happy. When we lose them, we become despondent. Each election now becomes existential because so many pieces of our identity are involved in that election. And an interesting thing is that voter anger and bias have a strong base in identity, not policy. In fact, as part of my book, I did interviews with my neighbors. And I saw a strong dislike of the other side. I saw a lot of cynicism about government on one side, But what I didn't see were really strong differences on issues. It's really interesting. The conservatives who I interviewed, the people who backed certain candidates, they like big government. They like their Medicare, they like their Social Security. So, you know, what political scientists say is that people in American voters are operationally conservative, they are ideologically conservative and operationally liberal, meaning they call themselves conservatives, but you ask them about specific programs, get your hands off my darn Medicare, you know, they operationally like those programs. So that, what I described is what affective liberalization, affective polarization is, dislike of the other side. So let's just do a quick, what I'm gonna do as we go through this entire presentation, we're gonna tie things together again and again. So we just talked about how the party's divided. Then we talked about how voters divided among multiple characteristics, including even their morality, and that these cleavages correspond to our party affiliation. With all of these differences, we now have affective polarization, which is heightened by those differences. We dislike the other party even more, and this is the other part that's interesting, even more than we like our own. We actually don't like our own party all that much. We just dislike the other party more. Now we will move to how these cleavages threaten liberal democracy itself. First, we'll define liberal democracy so we understand what we're talking about. Then we will discuss several sources of discontent against liberal democracy, economic inequality and cultural conflict, which weaken citizens' commitment to liberal democracy. So, oh yeah, but I have to take a drink after each session. That'll slow things down a little. Okay. Democracy refers, I'm gonna break up liberal democracy into liberal and democracy. Democracy refers to a set of binding electoral institutions, representation electoral systems, that effectively translate majority views into public law and policy. The liberalism part of liberal democracy does not mean liberal versus conservative. We're talking about a classical definition here, referring to commitments to the rule of law and to guarantees of individual rights such as freedom of speech, worship, press, and association. In recent decades, as our Supreme Court has made rulings that make us more value neutral, it has also referred to the unfettered ability of individuals to live as they please in accordance with their own chosen ends in life. A liberal democracy is a political system that combines both. When we talk about threats to liberal democracy, they can be threats where either part of that equation, liberal or the democracy, corrodes. So a democracy can be deficient in the liberal part, or a liberal democracy can be deficient in the democracy part. Let's give an example. The US suffers from deficiencies in the democracy part of liberal democracy. We protect minorities, we protect freedom of speech, etc. But our system fails to represent the will of the majority due to gridlock and veto points, and I'm going to go into that a lot. Hungary, on the other flip side of where we talk about illiberal democracy, it is that because its speech and incentives, it favors conservative Christianity, but impacts to either one tend to affect the other one. So, liberal regimes with severe deficiencies in democracy, like the US with its gridlock, we are at risk of populists gaining power and eroding protections of minorities and further eroding democracy after that. Illiberal regimes have populist leaders who in many cases have overcome constitutional safeguards in order to stack the deck so they stay in power. So that's the democracy deterioration in those illiberal democracies, and it happens all over the world these days. So now we're going to talk about some specific things that are corroding voters' belief in their liberal democracy. Greasing the wheels is growing economies where gains are broadly shared. And that helps people become a lot more satisfied, even if there are programs, redistributive programs. It helps trust. That has not been the case in the US. Stagnating wages since the 1970s have occurred for the middle class. Growth has gone mainly to the top 10% and up. China's rise hurt the rural Rust Belt the most in the early 2000s. And the benefits of globalization went to financial and knowledge-based communities on the coasts. Rural communities were left behind, relatively. All this is relative. Economics is relative. How people feel about how they're doing is they look at their neighbor and they say, I'm doing as well or I'm not doing as well. Both parties are responsible for globalization's impact. Clinton pushed trade deals and Glass-Steagall repeal, that is the separation of investment banking and banking. That deregulation occurred under him with Republican support. Over-financialization in the 2008 crisis had bipartisan roots, therefore. The people and communities who are left behind, they interpret these potential losses they interpret being left behind in terms of status. And so this being left behind becomes a cultural issue. And so that's where we're going to turn. We're going to turn to culture to understand discontents. The Tea Party was an early indication of the anti-elite populist culture that's now taken off in the US. It was a predictor of wider popular support for obstructive politics and Trump's populism. While the Tea Party was labeled as a revolt for fiscal responsibility by its national spokesman, dominated by the Koch brothers and Fox, who kind of took that niche, the actual people who were in it found that research have found that the actual people who were in the chapters were concerned more with perceived US cultural decline. Obama's presidency raised their fears of the ascendance of a multicultural US with reduced power and status for traditionalists. TARP and other recovery programs were viewed through cultural eyes. They were seen as benefits going to freeloaders. Compromise to integration was strongly opposed by the Tea Party. Politically, the Tea Party moved the Republican Party to the right into a mood of obstruction, even of their own congressional leadership, as we saw when John Boehner resigned, and lots of other Republicans have resigned since then. However, what this doesn't explain is why cultural backlash has been worldwide. It's happening all over the world. Pippa Norris and Ronald Engelhardt in Cultural Backlash provide a model based on generational shifts explaining the global rise of populist parties. They empirically described the mainstream cultural adoption of countercultural concerns starting in the 60s. They document how these concerns for new family structures, support for diversity and cosmopolitanism have penetrated the culture and have replaced material politics. You know, politics is usually divided in two ways: who gets what, and who are we. And who gets what has kind of disappeared from the horizon. It's all about who we are right now. Their research demonstrates that traditionalists find these changes, especially rising diversity, threatening to their sense of security, group identity, and social status. The relevance of these threats predicts support for populist leaders. But why now? What they explain, these authors, is that there's a tipping point where traditionalist groups see themselves losing dominance they once had. And that enables populists to convince them that they are being manipulated by elites. Tipping points include economic loss, seen through cultural eyes, and fear of immigrants changing the dominant culture, leading to their country's decline. The populist, based on what the situation is in that country, can then transform votes into seats or power, depending on their appeal, and in institutions preventing populism from taking over in each country. Democratic backsliding may or may not occur. And by the way, not all populists. Populism is not always a bad thing. We've seen populism through our history. You know, William Jennings Bryan, Many of the things that he said were incorporated into the Democratic Party. I can give a bunch of examples. I don't want to go off script here or I'll lose my time. All right, culture on the left has adopted an anti-liberal strain. I want to be fair here. And actually, I'm not concerned with fairness. What I'm concerned with is indicating that the threats to from culture have occurred on the left as well as the right. On college campuses, theories of structural racism have challenged assumptions that African Americans can be successfully integrated into white society, or that it's even worthwhile, since racism, according to these theories, permeate all interactions in the law. For some leftist theorists, language is not a means to objective knowledge, but is rooted in power relations. That's the basis for challenges to free speech, which have occurred on a number of campuses. A related belief is that only affected groups can speak for themselves, as only they can interpret their lived experience. Meritocracy is sometimes criticized as a culturally biased tool of repression. So what's the impact of this identity prism of the left? It's corrosive to liberal goals for progress, but it's also inspired the right's adoption of their identity politics. For example, Christian nationalism, which, by the way, is not always is not always a belief held by Christians. Studies have shown that it is a distinct identity. And dismissal of objective truth, meaning that there are alternative facts. We can see the same thing, and there are different facts occurring. So let's tie the threads together again. I'm about to move to a new set of threats, but we've shown how we're divided by party affiliations, which stand for an entire worldview and even moral codes. We've defined liberal democracy, and we've identified sources of discontent, loss of economic status, and cultural conflict. When these discontents cannot be addressed politically or socially, an affective polarization, dislike of the other side, is already in place. Conditions are ripe for populists. Sometimes, and sometimes not, populists significantly erode liberal democracy from within. When they do, they often use disinformation, which we're going to talk about, as a tool, and even so on its own, even without the populists. Disinformation is clearly a threat to democracy because we need common facts to discuss and solve problems. So, onward to populists and disinformation.
Drink.
Okay.
Mike's doing the camera.
Populism around the world, it follows a playbook. It's very, very similar. What populists do around the world is the same thing in many, many countries. They claim to be, and they say the same things, they claim to be correcting democracy's deficit by representing the forgotten majority in order to fix the country's chaos and decline. You may have heard people talk about how our country's so chaotic and it's falling into decline. This is the way populists talk. The people are virtuous. They've been betrayed by incompetent, corrupt elites, former leaders, the press, outsiders, immigrants, Muslims, other countries, who are responsible for their problems. Only some of the people are real. The rest don't count. And I could give you some quotes there, basically that say the rest don't count. Experts are denigrated. It doesn't matter how much you know, how much you've done in a field. Fixes are common sense. Some populists, once in power, stay within the system's boundaries. Others, however, come to regard democratic institutions as part of the problem, and they corrode liberal democracy using a variety of tools. A favorite is cracks in the law, extra-legal means, putting loyalists on courts, prosecuting enemies, packing courts, etc. For these populists, use of disinformation becomes strategic. If such tools are successful, democratic backsliding will occur. So, I want to talk about disinformation and its variants. I'm going to provide some definitions, but first I want to provide one from George Costanza on Seinfeld. Jerry, just remember, it's not a lie if you believe it. All right, start with, which is really perfect. Disinformation. Politically motivated messaging strategically designed to engender apathy, mistrust, and paranoia. It's not always lies. It's to confuse people. Hannah Arendt, who's written about totalitarianism, has a great paragraph that I don't have time to read here, but she talks about the goal of propaganda is to confuse people, get you so befuddled you don't know what's true. It's to disincentivize citizen engagement and mobilization. Misinformation is inadvertent sharing of false information. Actually, I crossed out the inadvertent because when people share stuff, they want to share it. They're doing it to get likes. They're doing it to become part of a team. They tend to believe what they're sharing, but they're doing it really for recognition. We all want recognition. Propaganda is a set of non-rational arguments or symbols to either advance or undermine a political ideal. It's designed to elicit emotional attachment or revulsion. So it's a little bit more direct than disinformation, which is often can be, see what sticks, throw it against the wall, confuse people. Financially motivated fake news. News tailored to satisfy viewers, even if it involves spreading disinformation. For example, Fox got sued. They knew they were spreading disinformation after the 2020 election, but they did it anyway. Disinformation and misinformation campaigns thrive in polarized societies with low trust of institutions and leaders. We live in a low trust society. Also critical is support for these lies by populists and elites. So we usually think about the supply of disinformation and not about the demand. People actually seek out disinformation, and here is why. Disinformation satisfies needs for comprehension and community. We need to understand our world. People do this in different ways. Some have a need for cognition, verification, and thinking things through carefully. Others do it based on intuition. They kind of know what's true and what's right, less need to verify. And community plays a really big role in this. What does my team think? Can I signal my compliance? Can I get recognition for my team for what I believe? Demand for disinformation is not symmetric across left and right. And I'm not saying this out of bias. I'm saying it because people have done studies. People on the right tend to be more intuitionist. People on the left tend to have a little bit more of a need for cognition. They need to check out those facts. I'm not looking to bop anyone on the head. This is simply things we should understand. The supply of disinformation is designed to satisfy the demand. So supply follows demand. Partisan news media cater to and reinforce existing identities. So what the media does is reinforce those identities. Identity threats, and they do this through identity threats, which arouse emotions and keep their audience coming back. Politicians seeking attention are seeking to satisfy the demand for aggressive behavior, which assures coverage. The more outrageous you are, the more you get coverage. Like misinformation, the sharing of disinformation occurs because social media users want to act like broadcasters. They want likes and recognition. But some pieces of media also increase polarization besides reinforcing it. Social media, with a lack of gatekeepers, encourages populists and hostile foreign governments to conduct disinformation commands, and algorithms lead users to the extremes. Let's just talk about conspiracies. There are several different types of conspiracies. Classic conspiracism uses detailed facts to explain a confusing world, asserting that powerful people or groups always control events. Example, the Kennedy assassination and people's attempt to understand it through very detailed theories. But modern conspiracism is more about many people are saying. It dispenses with the facts to delegitimize institutions and the opposition. It's defended based on repetition. example, elections are rigged. That's just a statement. It's not necessarily backed up by facts when it's said, but it's repeated over and over and over, and people begin to believe it. Can rebuttals of conspiracies change minds? It's not easy to change those who believe a conspiracy, as their first instinct is to discredit the source of evidence. But rebuttals can change that portion of believers of conspiracies who are not quite as certain about it. And studies have shown that there are large percentages of those types of believers of conspiracies. Focus should be on cordoning off true believers, those prone to conspiracies, from spreading rumors to non-believers. That has implications for social media. Even hardcore believers, and I find this just a little bit soothing, not too much, but even hardcore believers can be persuaded just slightly when exposed to the truth. But countervailing aspect of that is that fluency, repetition of the lie, can also reinforce belief. That's the way our minds work. And what is really key is that a trusted persuader, especially if they speak out against their apparent interests, can persuade the uncertain and even sway believers. All right, let's tie the threads together again. Going to move to the next topic. We talked about economics and cultural conflict provide fertile ground for populists and populist demagogues to use the divisions we already have through our political affiliations to attempt to take power, and how disinformation is one tool they may use to achieve their agenda of control. We'll now talk about U.S. democracy and its unique vulnerabilities to populists. Mainly, and what we're mainly going to talk about, is that our political institutions, from the Constitution on, encourage a politics of conflict and extremism rather than problem solving. I just want to say one thing. I have extraordinary admiration for our founders and Madison, who wrote the Constitution. But we have to understand they were the first guys who wrote a constitution for a mass country, for a big country. And political scientists have learned a whole lot since then. Our structure is an outlier. No one adopts our structure when they adopt a constitution today. They adopt proportional representation. We are the opposite of proportional representation. Okay, I've gone off script, but it's valuable stuff. Onward to talk about U.S. democracy and key potential U.S. democratic reforms. All right, 30 minutes. I'm going to try and keep this to 45 so that we have time for questions. I'll stay as long as you like. The primary issue with U.S. democracy at this point is its gridlock, which comes from intense competition with a lack of incentives for compromise within the system. Personally, everything I've read doesn't show that this is going to change in the near future. I haven't seen what trend is going to disrupt 50-50 competition between the parties, basically meaning that the parties in every election are aiming for control, which in the U.S. system of checks and balances impedes legislative activity as the parties shed the desire to legislate and instead want to fight with each other in order to gain control. Cultural backlash has given the Republican coalition new voters coming from the working class and from Democrats. Democrats continue to get some voters as well from the young, who are unreliable with voters, and some independent swing voters, but not yet enough to create a solid permanent electoral majority. And also there are biases in our system that favor small states and rural areas. So we are a 50-50 electorate. Given 50-50 parity, there are some other trends discouraging compromise between the parties. One factor is that our primary systems discourage compromise. In safe districts, which are 83% of the total, generally just 25% of the voters of a party, activists who are generally more extreme than average voters, choose who's going to be the office holder from that district. And that assures, as the Republican Party primarily gets more extreme, that more extreme candidates join Congress. And let me defend that statement. that the Republican Party has moved more to the right than the Democratic Party has moved to the left. The Democrats have moved to the left. You could see the movement from 2016 to 2020. However, people have done roll call studies where they show how parties have moved, and Republicans over time have moved a lot further to the right. Some of this, actually, I could just go way off course, but some of this, Michelle, I'm not sure if that's Hemmer, has written a book about the Republican Party and how it's moved to the right. And a lot of it came at the end of the Cold War and with the demise of the Cold War. Anyway, I could just go on and on. To avoid being primary, representatives avoid compromise. Due to affective polarization, extreme dislike of the other party, voters accept and vote for their party's nominee. Hence, in safe district, extremists win. As Congress has become less effective, presidents have become more powerful, raising the stakes of elections even further in what is a doom loop. Our legislative processes also discourage compromise and exacerbate conflict. There is little overlap between congressmen of different parties, leaving little room for compromise. Comparing unfavorably to the 4 parties under the hood that we had way back when, of course, civil rights were not on the table, but in terms of effectiveness, those 4 parties and bipartisan legislation were a lot more effective. Today, bills come top down from leadership, whereas until the 1980s, bipartisan committee members worked in decentralized fashion using committee experts to develop and pass that legislation. Congressional committee expertise has withered, with budgets now concentrated in the leadership office, and those leadership dollars have shifted to messaging. Government is frequently divided. We have a structure of government that no other country, well, other countries do have it, but they have modified it over time. But in our government, the federalism, the separation of powers with 2 houses in Congress, a president who's elected separately as opposed to parliamentary systems, have assured that we have a lot of veto points, and minorities are incented to obstruct lawmaking because we have all these veto points. The filibuster, which is a self-imposed Senate procedure, obstructs majority rule. With equal parties and electoral rules favoring the extremes, gridlock is likely to persist. It's clearly destructive to governing. Only crises such as Ukraine or the debt ceiling force Congress to act. Congress chooses not to act, not to solve problems, immigration, budgetary procedures, the deficit, etc., most of the time. When Congress does legislate, it's during rare times of unitary government, and the resulting legislation is often rammed through without broad support. This ineffective government fuels populism by undermining democracy's appeal. So, now I'm going to go to what are the solutions. I'm only going to talk about a few because these would be the most impactful. 1, we need to have electoral systems reform to elect broadly representative candidates. The problem to solve, as political candidates conflict keeps ratcheting up, activists keep nominating ever more extreme candidates. In the general election, due to affective polarization, dislike of the other party, voters elect ever more extreme office holders in safe districts. Reform needs to change that. We need more broadly representative candidates. The key reform, adopt final 5, so the handout, I think I mentioned I'm going to give a handout with a reading list. On the flip side, it's going to explain, it doesn't explain blanket primaries, I'll do that, but it explains ranked choice voting. Anyway, adopt final 5 blanket primaries where candidates from any party and independents appear on one ballot. All voters affiliated and independent can vote in this primary. The top 5 finishers, regardless of party, advance to the general election where the winning candidate is elected via ranked choice voting. You'll have to read about ranked choice voting, but what it does is it encourages candidates to care about how they debate and talk to their opponents, because their opponents, voters, second, third, fourth, and fifth choices could go to them if no one has 50%, because these things are tallied in round after round automatically. And so it tends to moderate the campaigning that people do. In presidential elections, we should adopt ranked choice voting in all states. There is a proposal for proportional electoral college, but the idea there is that when, I think it's 2/3 or 3/4 adopted, we would switch the states that have signed the compact would go to proportional voting. Well, if the rest don't do that, you got a problem. So that's why that's not one of my recommendations here. Impact of the reform on office holder equality and electoral incentives. Blanket primaries would increase the competitiveness of districts and races, as in California and Alaska, and more moderate candidates when turnout increases. No candidate is a spoiler. This is a big deal. This would allow third parties, fourth parties, et cetera, to run in a race and independents to run. And there, they would not be a spoiler because they would probably not win the plurality to start out with, or the 50%. And their votes, they might be at the bottom, and their votes would go to another candidate, their second choices, third choices, et cetera, of the voters who went for them. But it would allow more competition. And candidates must win with 50% of the vote. We have many elections where candidates win with a plurality, not with 50%. That is a democratic issue. How to adopt it: active Congress or by states. Currently, 4 states have nonpartisan primaries, and they have worked to reduce some of the harshness of their politics. And California, for example, went from being a state where people hated the way their houses worked to a state where now over 50% of the voters like it. Okay, there are 4 reforms, just so you know. Reform number 2, enlarge the House and make districts multi-member to increase cross-cutting competition. The problem to solve: in the US till 1920, we increased the size of the House. The House now, House members now represent 750,000 citizens, 6 or 7 times more than in other democracies. That's too high. Secondly, the problem is that 83% of voters in safe districts suffer from a lack of competition. One party controls their district forever, and their primaries are uncompetitive. Opposition voters in some districts have been underrepresented for decades. Proportional representation, which I'm suggesting here, would restore multi-parties to urban and rural areas. Imagine if Chicago had both Republicans and Democrats representing it. And if we here in Berrien County, we do have more of this is a little bit more of a swing area. But let's say that we had permanent representation in given districts from both Republicans and Democrats. It would change the way we think about our politics, and it would change the way people legislate. So the key reforms to double the House. In addition, combine districts and make them multi-member with 5 members per district to encourage 4 to 5 party politics. Again, I can't explain every detail here, but this would have some benefits in terms of reducing the urban-rural divide. It would allow representation for wide swaths of the country who now are just represented by one party. And the emergence, and this is really key, of 2 to 3 new parties and competition would add new fluidity to legislative negotiations. We talked about 4 parties under the hood. That was really beneficial for legislation because people would get together on different dimensions. Different coalitions would get together on different things. Now it's just, who are we? And I hate the other side, who they are, right? What we want is more competition where, for example, let's take an example. Let's say they were a working party and they represented the economic interests of worker, and that was their purpose. It would focus attention on that, and it would prevent identity politics from overwhelming the economic demands for equality. So what you need to do this is an act of Congress to repeal the Uniform Congressional District Act passed in 1967, which prohibits multi-member districts. By the way, staying away from constitutional amendments, impossible to do. right now. You need 3/4 of the states, you need a lot of, it's just not gonna happen right now. Then you need an act of Congress in order to institute this proposal. Number 3, re-engineer, and I'll go through this pretty quickly because I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Re-engineer the Senate and House legislative machinery to modernize lawmaking processes. I belong to a group called Fix Us, which has monthly Zoom meetings, and they have all sorts of reform groups that are part of it. And one set of Congress people, they have 2 Congress people, Representative Kilmer, and then there's someone from the other party, and they are head of a committee to modernize Congress, but they don't have as much of a domain, but they still have some domain. What we need is to redesign these legislative processes, and this would come after we have more moderate members from the first 2 proposals, to redesign how legislation works. There are a lot of experts in business who redesign businesses from top to bottom. That's the kind of redesign we need in terms of how legislation is done. Negotiation experts, people who know how organizations ought to be designed. Get them involved to redesign Congress. We also vastly underspend on Congress compared with prior years, and not errors, but years. Congress should fund research in accordance with the organizational structure determined by the Working Commission. What would be the result? Well, it would be a far better process for making legislation, but it would allow legislation to be done from committees or whatever the right organizational structure is, so it's not all top-down. 4th one, and this is, I think, my last slide maybe. Implement civics education to teach obligations of citizenship and promote solidarity. The problem to solve: citizens need to understand U.S. history and political structure in a standard but objective way. Can't have any whitewashing. On the other hand, it can't be there's never been progress made. We need to have an understanding of the guardrails of democracy. We understand how progress is made. We also need to be taught our obligations to one another. So here we get into morality being combined from the left and the right. To defend our country, to seek out facts, to get some social media training so that people aren't duped, to vote, to be civil and listen to other citizens. And I think it's fairly obvious, what this means, but there's another piece of it. There's another piece that would be really good to promote, which is national service, to promote mixing of citizens. But also we need to have a national discussion about steps to enhance citizen participation in communities and their government. And one thing I mentioned was that we become very value neutral. Our Supreme Court in the 60s made a lot of rulings that enhanced the idea that we should be value neutral. Freedom of speech. A guy, has a shirt that says, well, F you, right? And that's expression now. We have, anyway, I think it's very clear that citizens need to be taught what it means to be citizens. And the fact that we've abandoned that, and that used to be a really big part of how we would train people. The arguments that Madison and Hamilton made about manufacturing versus agriculture, they were about what kind of citizens do we want to see. There are a lot of ways of thinking about this. I'd recommend a guy named Michael Sandel. He's written great books about communitarian type democracy. Okay, I'll stop there. I will take QA and discussion. Yes. Anybody? Oh, I have to appoint somebody. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you.
Oh.
Second of all,
You're welcome.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I think one of the missing components, and you covered a lot of really good information, is the quality that it takes to persuade people. And I'm talking about emotional persuasions. And the reason I'm talking about this is, and I will rely on some expertise. I taught at a liberal arts college for 30 years, and I taught advertising. And the component that works the best in advertising is appealing to people's emotions. It's very persuasive. It works like a charm. And Aristotle said, use logic, not emotion, because logic is fair and emotion is unfair. But you throw that out with politics and advertising. So my question now is, all of these reforms, it seems to me, rest on persuading people like us, and people in Congress, and people who hold the levers of power, persuading them that there is a path forward, and that how do you incorporate honest emotion as a persuasive tool?
Okay, so that's a great question. So let me say, first of all, like in California, the two parties hated when they put in direct private open primaries, with non-partisan primaries. And so a lot of times these things happen through ballot initiatives in those states. It's going to happen either on a national level, but that's hard to see, or it will have to grow state by state. So is any of this easy? No. And your point about emotions, it's absolutely true that people respond, to emotions. And Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, talks about how people come to a position first, and then they argue to convince people themselves of their position. And so rational thought and rational argument often comes second after people decide what they think or feel based on their moral code. So yeah, that's absolutely a good point. But on the other hand, we do have rational thought. And when we have a large society, you can't run it just on emotion. You can appeal to the heart, to some extent, but then people have got to pay attention to how things work, how large societies work, and beyond their groups. So our emotions are oriented towards our groups and our self-identity. You have to get beyond that by appealing to what gives solidity. So part of what people talk about when they talk about revitalizing our democracy, a lot of times is, what kinds of things can we do to revitalize our commitment to our entire country and not just to a section? So this is where the idea of national service comes from. So, okay, I could keep going, but that's the basic point is, we need to have rational people need to design systems and incentives that end up changing people's behavior in an emotional way. So, you need both the head and the heart. Yeah. Hi.
Hello. First off, thank you. Secondly, which YouTube channel is this going up to? Do you know the name of it?
I'll send out a link. The library will have it.
Support the center.
Support the center. Yeah, go there. Supportthecenter.org.
Table behind you.
It,
Thank you. And then, I just had a quick question.
yes.
So it seems to me that the polarization is done on purpose by the political parties. I think it's related to the bigger picture of the uninformed voter base idea, i.e. people who self-segregate because of polarization or otherwise because they're uninformed. They're easier to control, therefore they're easier to keep as a voter base because they won't question whatever the party is.
Yeah, people talk about, first of all, there are a large number of voters who are not really voting on policy. If you read Larry Bartels, he wrote Democracy for Realists. I didn't put it on the reading list, I almost did. But he talks about how people vote based on identity. And they don't actually understand or know a lot about the specific policies that they're voting for. So your point is exactly right. We need to appeal to larger identities that get to people's better natures in terms of cooperation. Does that make some sense? Or
It does, because I also think we need to, keep it very brief, we need to probably encourage people to, just, if you're not told, you can ask questions, right? Is what you said right, or was I told, right? Verify.
Could you repeat the question? Say that a little louder.
If you stand up and repeat, yeah.
Yeah, so the idea is, if people aren't told you it, obviously being nice and not being confrontational, ask questions, i.e. are the things you said correct? Am I told it, right? Are your politicians, whoever they are, speaking the
Well, I would, another book I'm gonna recommend, and I think I did put it on the list, was Jonathan Rauch's The Constitution of Knowledge. And that is about, to use a big word, the epistemology of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And what Jonathan Rauch talks about is, how is truth established in a society? And truth is actually established by falsifiability. That's what Karl Popper says. Falsifiability is that hypotheses are not established by belief. They're established when they can't be shot down. And that is just sort of the opposite of what you would think. But what's my point? My point is that we do need to have not alternative facts. We need, as a society, need to be able to work towards evidence-based discussions. And when you depart from those, now, that doesn't say that values don't come into play. And that's where I think we as a society in some ways fall down. We can't talk about values. There's no forum for talking about values except through this, who are we conflict. How many of us are able to talk with our neighbors about what we actually think or believe about, different kinds of values without it, turning into a, I'll walk a mile in your shoes and take your moccasins kind of discussion. And that's what civic communitarians want to see be able to happen, is that people are able to work through those values. Too much of our policy is content neutral in terms of values. Yes?
I'd like to take the first two things right off the table, all those big things about ranked choice, this, that, and the other. The last two, I think, have some real model building opportunities in the Madisonian thinking, when there were only 3 or 4 million people. First congressional districts were 40,000 people. I would suggest that Berrien County, through its community college, could have community forums on many, many topics, and basically not on political topics. People will not go to political topics. If you talk about education, if you talk about housing, we talk about health, you talk about water quality, you talk about broadband, and things that we all sort of don't quite know exactly what we know.
Okay.
I'm just saying is that, and in the last one, project-based learning is something that can be for every student in the country, where each person is challenged to figure out what that person wants to figure out, and they can put it into visual form, poster form, etc. I'm just saying is, because whenever, the temperature is so high.
Thank you. I want to leave time for other questions if there are any. So I want to respond to what you're saying. Great ideas. So one thing though, there are groups like Braver Angels, they're in the reform space, and they get neighbors together and they talk about, who people are, etc. And the idea is to take the temperature down and get people to know other kinds of people, etc. I personally, from my experience, the hardest thing is to really talk about policies and differences in politics with neighbors. Personally, I think it's great to get to know them and like them. Maybe they don't see you as much of a, if they do, as a demon, but that doesn't get to the heart of what's going on. It's that we can't talk about differing values and differing politics. We need to find a forum for that. I don't know what it is, but that's what I think is in my view, is really needed. Yes?
Thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Thanks.
I live here in New Buffalo as a resident, and my wife is an Australian citizen, who spent a lot of time in Australia. I watch the Australian politics and voting there. And they use your RCB, as you probably know,
Mhm.
as far as ranking.
Mhm.
And it's very effective, but it's also effective because they have compulsory voting. You know, we don't have that in this country. And everybody has to vote there, that's a citizen, or they get fined, and it's
Yeah.
controlled at the national level.
Yeah.
And that makes a difference, especially combined with your RCB.
You know what my thought is? Why don't we have them take a COVID shot when they're voting as well? No, I'm just kidding. No. I should not be snarky like that. I'm sorry. I'm really just making a joke. But let me just say, you know, that's a really, Australia, thanks for bringing it up. Malcolm Turnbull talked at the Southwest Economic Association, or whatever it's called, at the Mendel Center. And he talked about all the things that Australia's done. So Australia, like us, came out of the British systems, and they have managed, along with the Irish, Ireland, have managed to change their systems to work better. Ireland uses RCB too. They all had slightly different ways of doing it, you know, but, and they have compulsory voting. Now, the thing I would say is it would be really great if we could combine civics with compulsory voting, because we have a lot of voters who don't vote because they are so turned off. And it would be really good if there were a way to integrate them into the system in a more organized way, just saying, all right, starting today, you need to vote. I just don't know how we do it and how it would work, but I think the idea is really good. We need to get more citizens voting. And one thing that's really good about switching it up in terms of competition with multi-member districts or blanket primaries is that people do get more excited, because people who represent their particular interests, if you had 3 or 4 parties, you know, would get them more excited. Right now they're so turned off because we have 2 parties that are always fighting with each other, you know, and you know, what's the point of my voting, especially if I live in a safe district, you know? So if we could change the incentives to vote, that would help as well. And if we did that, then we had a requirement to vote, you know, it would really make a lot more sense to do that. Leslie?
Yeah, several people brought up like taking down the temperature of things, and for me, I feel it's so important to take that to heart my own self, and that in my engagement with my friends, colleagues, neighbors, to take my own temperature down about things, and it's not so easy, so.
No, it's really not easy. Our identities, all of us, are really, I mean, the last few weeks have been pretty, you know, pretty active weeks, right? I mean, you know, our temperatures go up based on what's going on. And you know what? There's also another thing, which is all of us, some of us are retired. We really, if we had the choice, we would not want to pay attention to any of this. We would want to know that we have, you know, moderate candidates who can do what they're supposed to do, legislative processes, they work, and we can go and tend to our garden, right? But it's not like that. You know, so it would be great if we could turn the temperature down, but a lot of that depends on reform and straightening things out. Yes?
Yeah, I guess I'm still kind of skeptical, because
Yeah.
like in this state for the last 40 years, one party didn't have any control, and they just got control for a couple of years, and they passed a lot of legislation that, in their mind, helped the citizens of this state, and got a lot of things done. Whether you agree with it or not, they passed a lot of things. Now we've got another party that just, you know, running the House and the federal level, that thinks it's a big accomplishment, only to hire a speaker and to pass a budget. And they don't seem to be helping anybody. And I don't see large groups on either side saying which one they like. They don't seem to be impressed with when you do things
you know,
for them, or they don't seem to be impressed if you sit there and do nothing.
Yeah, so you know, one thing I want to say is, one thing I didn't do in this talk was recommend that one side try and win and the other side, beat the other side. I'll tell you why, because we are a 50-50 country. And it ain't going to happen, at least not right now. So one side, I was gonna use as an example, Heather Cox Richardson. I like what she writes, but what she's writing is a political, I like it for its explanatory power. I don't like all of it. But it, can pull some threads together, but she is making a political case. That is not what reform is about. Reform is about getting those two sides to talk to each other and to make legislation. We are a 50-50 country. You can't say that one side, although I do understand what you're saying, but in terms of reform, it has to be directed towards getting everyone to compromise. That's how the machinery needs to work. We are gonna be in a world of hurt if we don't figure out how to do that.
No,
Yes.
you missed my point.
Okay, I missed your
My
point.
point was, things were passed, but I don't see anybody talking about it either positively or negatively. On the other side, things were
Yeah.
not done at all, and nobody's complaining like, we need to change the system
and-
to get things done for the regular people.
Yeah, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing with, some of your points. What's really interesting about that is when legislation is done by one party and they're in unitary control, what they tend to do is pass legislation which doesn't have broad bipartisan support. Now, there are exceptions. We've seen that in the last year nationally, in 2021 and 22.
No, you keep missing the point.
Okay,
My point is,
yeah.
nobody seems to care if you pass it or not.
Well,
My point.
Well, people that are not policy oriented in a lot of cases.
That's what I'm saying, so
Oh,
when you say
yeah.
you wanna change the system so we can have, people working together, they don't care if it's working now at all.
No,
That's
so
my whole point.
I think people do care that it's not working. They see the gridlock, they see the conflict. And yes, people are not particularly policy oriented, but they would be a lot more satisfied if they saw that the government was doing things that were in the public interest. I do think people would notice that. And it's a good discussion.
Sir, do you mean, when you say people don't care if it passes or not, do you mean the citizens or do you mean congressional members?
Both.
Okay,
How many people are calling their Congress people saying, are they passing something or not passing something?
but to Bill's point, if we were to institute ranked choice voting and you would have all chocolate and vanilla, as my dad used to say, come to the table, there would be a lot of pressure that you have to talk to each other, you have to listen, because you may not care about the working party, or you may not care about the climate change party, but when you've got 3, 4, and 5 parties at the table, the pressure is going to allow for more compromise and more caring, as you put it, and more success.
I understand that part. I'm
Yeah.
understanding how do you get there when people are so apathetic, they don't care who's in their power now. As long as they appease to their tribal, I identify with this guy, so even if you never do anything in my best interest, I'm gonna vote for you because you're in my
Well,
tribe.
what we're talking about is not taking identity off the table. That's the point. We're talking about having enough points of view represented by different parties so that it's not all one-dimensional conflict. That's the whole, in fact, that's the whole point of the talk in a way.
I understand that, but I'm saying
Is
if
it,
you
no,
got
let me finish. It's that we're not talking about the fact that conflict should be taken off the table. We're talking about that conflict should be managed. And that's the difference. And by the way, if it is managed by the people in Congress, maybe people don't care outside of Congress, but then at least it's managed in Congress. Those are the incentives we want to change. But, yeah.
The only other thing is, unless the people get to the point where identity isn't enough, they need more than that, I don't think we're gonna get it changed. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, and having more parties, so that, for example, the example I used, let's say we had a Christian nationalist party who overtly say, we want Christianity, spread out more through society. They can fight for what they want. Some people who are into that would get excited about it. It's not, I'm not saying that's the way our Constitution is written or isn't written. I'm just saying people might fight for that. Let's say we had a workers' party. that would start to put the who gets what stuff back on the table, because it's not on the table now, in a way that it really should be. There's a lot of duplicity, there's a lot of, people are not aligned with their material interests, they're aligned with their identity, even if it hurts them materially. Laws hurt them, materially. If they can be satisfied, they're happy. But having more choices on the table might help with that. It's not a panacea. Look, people for a long time, for decades, political scientists have seen that they often don't know a lot about policy. They often don't vote based on policy. One thing that Larry Bartels shows is that shark attacks in New England increased dissatisfaction that they had with their politicians. So, this was like in the early 1900s. So yes, people are not rational, but you at least want to design some rationality into the system. Yeah.
I appreciate what you've presented. It's really been helpful and
good.
informational.
Good.
I want to go a step further. You talked about Australia and Ireland having some different ways of processing their politics and running their governments. But you said at one point Australia changed from the British way to a way that works better. And I'm wondering how that change took place. Like if we could get some core ideas from how the change was basically begun.
That's a great point. I'll be honest, I'm not an expert in how it happened in Australia. I don't know, but definitely it's worth noting. And we've had periods in our own history when we've managed to reform. The primary reform that we had in the 1920s, and then the presidential primary reform we had in the late 60s and early 70s, probably were not, in the long run, not helpful reforms. But we've had periods of lots of reform, and it's not easy. It often happens through crises, through people coming together. Actually, a lot of the impetus for that came from church groups, from religious groups who were very, as did abolitionism, people who are very concerned morally and determined that things needed to change. So, when you have those organized movements towards reform, things can happen. Yeah, Bob?
What do you think of the idea of, instead of relying so much on our federal and state representatives, that we have more policy issues on the ballot, whereas the entire state populace, we vote on women's rights, gun control. Why can't we vote that, and then our representatives, or whoever's been voted as our representatives into our state legislatures, have to follow, that?
So let me tell you the pros and the cons, what I see. The pros is, obviously, it's direct democracy and that you get people voting. But I'll give you an example of how I voted for a reform on our Michigan ballot. 9 days of extra voting. And it's a reform that can't be repealed. It's very expensive. I'm not going to say whether it's good or, well, I think in a lot of ways, these kinds of reforms can have unintended effects. They are written in a way to persuade voters. And like Brexit, for example, that was direct democracy. But do you think the voters of Brexit would have said, "Oh yeah," after they saw what it did to their politics? Yeah, let's do that again. Let me vote again, and I'm going to vote yes again. I think direct democracy has some pros and it has some cons. There are times when you have to do it to override a legislature that just out of their own interest won't reform. But there are other times when it has impacts that then become stuck, like in California Proposition 19, is that what it's called? Preventing property taxes from being raised. Sometimes, that can be very rigid. So sometimes those direct things can be very rigid. What would really be better is a legislative process where those things can bubble up, bottom up, And if they represent broad, broad democracy. But there was something there that kind of spurred a thought, which is, we are a federal, if you read American history, you realize this. We are a federalist system with 50 states, and the founders really did not anticipate big government. And that is the source and the root of many of our issues today. We don't have really codified laws. When France wrote its constitution, the Napoleonic Code, they wrote everything out. I mean, everything's explained. The courts can't decide one thing one day. I'm not saying they can't, but we have a lot of back and forth in our courts and litigation that's based on states versus federal government. It makes our democracy a lot messier and a lot more difficult. Also, we have so many elections. No other country has as many elections as we do. So there are a lot of things in our structure that we're not going to get rid of, but we sort of have to focus on the things that we can change.
But based on that, you advocated for a larger government, twice the size in the House of Representatives, and that can be even worse if we have
No,
twice as many government.
well,
in the
actually,
cost
I was saying twice as many members, but that doesn't mean the government would necessarily be larger. Those members might vote for a smaller government, but I'm saying more representation to districts. But thank you for asking. Yeah.
Can I get a second question?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can all ask. We're here for as long as you want. Actually, there's another person who wanted to
I
ask a
just want
question.
to understand why you're against the compact notion, the fact that you cast your electoral ballots to the candidate that wins the popular vote in the country, because whether you only, I don't know any other office in the world where the popular vote doesn't decide who the president is.
Oh, I do agree with that, but you have to do it all at once. The compact says when 3/4 of the states agree to it, then it goes into effect for those states. And then you got a quarter of the states who aren't doing it, and then that's actually going to distort our representation and possibly
Why is
voting.
it distorted? If enough votes to get the electoral college to pass with these states, what do we care what the minority thinks about it?
All right, let me give you one example. California, on its own, adopts that popular vote thing. Then, let's say 40%, I don't know how California split, but let's say 40% of the electoral votes for California go to Republicans. That will change the outcome of the election right there and then. So if only one state does it, it's very clear that that's not the result that we want.
That's the whole point of the compact, is not one state doesn't do it.
No, 3/4 would do it, but the other quarter doesn't do it.
It doesn't go into effect
Yeah.
until 270 votes, until states have adopted this, they have 270 votes. So it doesn't-
Right, but again, I think I don't know enough. I'm gonna say, I'll take we all need to take another look at that. Maybe you're right, I don't know. You might be right.
Before everybody leaves, thank you very much.
I just wanna say, no topic is more important. Our discussion is really valuable. If there were a way that we could get people from both sides of the aisle to talk to each other more about stuff like this, we would be better off. Thank you for coming. Thanks.
Thank you.